Everybody better.
Oh, yeah. Oh. Welcome everybody to our special council meeting for October 2nd, 2023. I'd like to call this meeting to order and all members of council are present this evening. We acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. Hold on one second. We just have a technical difficulty. Okay, welcome everybody. I'd like to call the meeting to order. We acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi peoples, and of the Huron-Wendat peoples. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and of all the original peoples of Turtle Island who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. Any declarations of conflicts of interest from members of council? Seeing none, I need a mover and a seconder for the special council meeting agenda. Deputy Mayor Shepley, Councillor Verbeek, any questions? Seeing none, all in favor, and that is carried. We will go to reports from administration. We will go to our Director Chadwick, Director of Development Services, to review our parking requirements in the zoning bylaw. Ms. Chadwick.
Thank you, Mayor Bondi, and good evening, council and members of the public. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is a public meeting, a statutory public meeting under the Planning Act for a zoning bylaw amendment or a proposed zoning bylaw amendment to review parking requirements. If our team members and clerks could please pull up the presentation, please, and thank you. And we can begin. Next slide, please. So again, as indicated, it is a statutory public meeting. Council will hear representations from the public regarding the merits and concerns related to proposed zoning amendments. Council does not make a decision at this time. Next slide, please. And one more. So just as a friendly reminder as to why we're here today, the past term of council directed administration to review parking requirements for multi-residential dwelling units that, as we know in general terms, are apartments or condominiums in the town zoning bylaw. The town staff then supplemented this review to include parking requirements for single detached dwellings, semi-detached dwellings, as well as townhome dwellings. The current term of council has now directed administration to host the statutory public meeting. So back in August, we brought forward something called a report to council, and that essentially was information for your knowledge to either direct us to host a public meeting or not on zoning bylaw amendments for on-site parking. So here we are today. Next slide, please. So we discussed at the time the various council objectives within the strategic plan, as well as the climate change adaptation plan when reviewing parking requirements for multi-residential dwellings, as well as for singles, semis, towns, etc. you as a council have established goals where you would like to see areas within the town where higher density housing options are encouraged. You've also identified that one of your goals is to identify areas where the development of mixed-use buildings, commercial and residential, should be encouraged. And of course, we also have the council-adopted CCAP to consider to establish low-impact development practices, as well as building and strengthening the town's infrastructure resilience we need to consider in decision-making. Next slide, please. Something we'd like to bring to your attention today as a part of your future decision-making is the provincial objective, where you as a planning authority, you are a decision maker in land use planning decisions. What you are tasked with is making decisions that must be consistent with the provincial policy statement that says you shall provide for an appropriate range and mix of housing options and densities by permitting and facilitating all housing options. So any decision that you make as a planning authority, such amendments, for example, as zoning bylaw regulations, must be consistent with the PPS. Facilitating, that word has been emphasized on this slide because it's relevant to any discussion related to regulations linked to housing, either directly or indirectly. In this case, parking requirements for housing is indirectly related to facilitating housing options. The word facilitating in this context means to make it easier to allow for the construction of different housing types, such as townhomes and multi-unit dwellings. So in your decision-making, we ask you, council, to be mindful of how your decision on parking regulations will impact your obligation to facilitate the construction of a mix of housing types. Next slide, please. So we're just going to do a quick reminder of what the existing parking regulations are. To summarize, for multi-residential dwellings, apartments and condominiums, next slide, please. The current zoning bylaw regulations, and just as a point of clarification, multi-res is containing 5 or more dwelling units. So that current parking requirement is 1.25 parking spaces per dwelling unit. And as we described back in August, the requirement for visitor must come from that requirement. So of which 15% must be reserved for visitor parking. The table on the bottom here of the screen is an example of the current requirement for an apartment, let's say, has 10 units. There are 12 parking spaces that are required, 1 of which must be dedicated to visitor. And similarly, for a 50-unit apartment or condominium, 62 spaces are required, 9 of which must be dedicated to visitors. So again, it takes away from that tenant space. Next slide, please. This is just a comparison, a table that we put together at the time where we looked at our neighboring municipalities, and we saw that some municipalities require 1.25, some require 1.5. And then, of course, the one being Amherstburg only required 1, but it was under review at the time. And then we also looked at, of course, the requirement for visitor. Some municipalities did not have any requirements for visitor, whereas some required an additional, or Kingsville required an additional, and we at the town was within that number. Next slide, please. And as a summary or a reminder of what's required in the current zoning bylaw for single, semis, towns, as well as ADUs. Next slide, please. It is currently required that 1 parking space per dwelling unit is required across the board. That means for the ADU as well, 1 parking space is required for each additional dwelling units. As we know, under the new legislation for the More Homes Built Faster Act, municipalities must permit up to 2 ADUs per main dwelling, and that we must also permit tandem parking. Next slide, please. And this again is the table that helps to compare our counterparts and what other municipalities in our region are requiring. Some municipalities require 2 per unit. However, that could be offset by parking requirements for ADUs or not. So we're going to get into now a summary of our public consultation efforts. Now that council again has directed us to review the zoning requirements and opened up the window to public consultation. So Ms. Rita Jabour, our manager of planning services, worked with our junior planner, Ian Rawlings, as well as our manager of communications, Mark Tortola, to be able to provide council with a summary of what that public consultation looks like. So if you okay with you, Madam Mayor, we can pass that floor to Ms. Jabour.
Chadwick, and through you, Ms. Mayor, we're going to move ahead to the next slide. So as Ms. Chadwick explained, we had to be pretty unique and creative in how we reach the public with a general zoning amendment, because there isn't a specific radius and we have to notify since it's not site specific. It affects regulations that are across the board for all lands within the town of Essex. Next slide, please. So in order to reach a greater number of people, we developed a parking survey, which was available to residents of the town of Essex and to stakeholders. Those two groups of people were invited to provide their comments on the proposed zoning bylaw amendments that Ms. Chadwick had outlined earlier by completing the online survey. The survey was open from September 5th to September 18th of this year. A link to the parking survey was included in the public notice for this meeting, which was printed in both the Essex Free Press and the Harrow News, and was also published on the Town of Essex website. The survey was also published on social media sites such as Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn for the Town of Essex. And we also developed a media release, which was prepared to advertise the survey and to give notice of the public meeting. And I know at least one media channel, AMA 100 News, picked up that media release and it was published through that channel. In total, we received 32 survey responses. And in the next set of slides, we are going to review what those survey responses provided us in terms of information on public input on the proposed changes. So we're going to start with the parking survey results for the multi-residential dwellings. And when asked if the current parking regulations were adequate for tenants of multi-residential dwellings, tenants being those people who actually live full-time in apartment or condo buildings, most respondents did not consider our current parking regulations to be adequate. So on the screen there, you can see a circle which has two colors, a lighter blue and a darker blue. The lighter blue is no, and the darker blue is yes. Next slide, please. When asked if our current parking regulations were adequate for visitors, so these are persons who may be relatives, family, friends of those tenants, most respondents did not consider the parking regulations to be adequate for visitors. And again, you can see that identified as a light blue in the circle on the screen. Next slide, please. Most respondents, however, did agree that parking requirements in multi-residential dwellings should increase with the number of bedrooms in the unit. And as Ms. Chadwick had explained earlier, that is one of the proposed changes to the zoning bylaw for multi-residential dwellings, is that it be reflective of the number of bedrooms in a dwelling unit. So most respondents agreed with that approach. Next slide, please. The next series of slides are parking survey results for singles, semis, townhomes, and additional dwelling units. Next slide, please. So when respondents were asked whether the current parking regulations for single, semis, or townhome dwellings, again, that was one per dwelling unit, was adequate, they neither agreed or disagreed. There wasn't a consensus on whether it was or wasn't. And you can see in the circle that it was leaning more towards no. It was 15 opposed to 17, but it wasn't a general consensus on whether it is or isn't. Next slide, please. When asked if the parking in the required front yard should be allowed in residential districts, respondents were again split, and this time right in the middle. They neither agreed or disagreed that it should be allowed in the required front yard. There was no general consensus there. Next slide, please. Where respondents did agree, a majority, is that a portion of the required front yard should be maintained as a landscaped area. And you can see the results again, leaning towards agree on the circle. Next slide, please. The respondents also agreed that a minimum required landscaped area should be based on a percentage of the required front yard. There were some that didn't really have an opinion on this. That's why there's also a green section on the presentation as well. Next slide, please. And the reason that respondents chose overwhelmingly for permitting a landscaped area in the required front yard is to maintain a better neighborhood and community image. And you can see this reflected in a bar graph. Next slide, please. We also gave respondents the ability to provide additional comments in the survey. The majority of comments were with regards to respondents' concerns with increased off-site, that's on-street parking, as a result of deficient on-site parking opportunities, especially for multi-residential dwellings, such as those apartments and condos, and as well for low-density dwellings, such as singles, semis, and townhomes. However, there were survey comments that suggested that they welcomed alternative requirements for parking that would allow for flexibility, recognizing that parking is associated with more housing options. Next slide, please. So in the next few slides, we are going to recommendations. And these recommendations were based on survey results as well as the August discussion we had with council regarding our initial proposals. So in terms of the multi-residential dwellings, we are proposing the following zoning changes. As Ms. Chadwick had indicated earlier, we're proposing to separate the visitor parking from the required tenant parking, and visitor parking is now going to be additional to tenant parking as opposed to coming directly from that ratio. So specifically, we are recommending an additional 0.15 parking spaces for each dwelling unit for visitors. And again, that's on top of the required parking space for dwelling unit. Based on the survey results, we're also recommending that tenant parking be based on the number of bedrooms in a dwelling unit. Specifically, we're recognizing studio dwelling units, which really don't have delineated bedrooms. They're a lot smaller than your 1 bedroom or your 2 bedroom. They often come in buildings that are redeveloped or converted in the main street areas. We're recommending 1.25 parking spaces for a studio dwelling unit and a 1-bedroom dwelling unit. For those multi-residential dwellings that are comprised of dwelling units that have 2 bedrooms, we recognize that there is probably the need for more parking because there's more bedrooms. So we're recommending 1.5 parking spaces in those scenarios. And for anything more than a 2-bedroom dwelling unit, such as a 3+ bedroom dwelling unit, we're recommending 2 parking spaces for each of those dwelling units. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we wanted to provide you with, again, a little example of what our current requirement is using probably the 2 most recognizable multi-residential dwelling developments in the town of Essex and in McGregor Center, being Weston Apartments and Parnell Street. Wanted to show you what the current requirements are and what the tenant and visitor requirements would be should council propose and pass the required or the recommended regulations tonight. So under the current requirement for Weston Apartment, which is comprised almost entirely, actually entirely, of 2-bedroom dwelling units, 54 units, tenant spaces is 57, and visitor spaces is 10 for a total parking requirement of 67 parking spaces. If we based it on the proposed regulations tonight, when you would need 1.5 parking spaces for a 2-bedroom apartment, that would increase the number of tenant spaces to 81, the number of visitor spaces to 12, and the total number of parking spaces to 93. Using the Parnell Street example, it is comprised of 116 units, but it's actually majority 1-bedroom dwelling units. So there's about 89, one-bedroom dwelling units in that apartment building and 27 two-bedrooms. So it's a bit of a mix. In this scenario, using today's current requirements for tenant spaces, which is 1.25, you would get 124 parking spaces. And for visitor spaces, you would get 21 for a total number of parking spaces of 145. Using the proposed regulations, you would get a total of 150 tenant spaces, 22 visitor spaces, for a total of 172 parking spaces. Next slide, please. For single, semis, townhomes, and additional dwelling units, based on the survey results and based on the provincial policy statements and the requirement that we facilitate and that we permit all housing options, we are recommending that we maintain the current parking standard, which is 1 space per dwelling unit, but that we allow required parking spaces in the required front yard. So in the diagram on this slide, we identify where that required front yard is. So when you're looking at a lot and you're looking at the building footprint, you're measuring from the front lot line to the nearest main building on that lot, and everything in between is your required front yard. So in residential districts that support singles, semis, townhomes, the required front yard ranges from 20 to 25 feet. Currently, you cannot identify on your building plans when you're applying for a building permit that area is your required on-site parking space. We're proposing that it does count though. Next slide, please. We're also proposing changes to our zoning bylaw to allow for additional pavement. So we recognize that additional pavement is going to result because of the need for on-site parking. However, we're proposing changes to set the following landscape minimums for required front yards. And as you'll note, it's going to vary based on the width of a lot. So we know that today, land is a highly valuable resource. It's not unlimited. And we're recognizing that lots are getting smaller and smaller in order to accommodate more housing units. So that most lots today are probably meeting the minimum required lot width of 15 meters. So we've recognized that we cannot establish a single percentage for all these lots. So what we are recommending is that for a lot having a width of less than 12 meters, which is 40 feet, that 30% of that required front yard be landscaped. For a lot having a width of between 40 feet and 50 feet, 12 to 15 meters, that 40% of that required front yard be landscaped. And that for a lot that is greater than 15 meters or 50 feet, that 50% of that front yard be landscaped. And that landscaped area can consist of grass, trees, shrubs, flowers, wood chips, a water feature. It just cannot be an impermeable surface like asphalt or concrete. And again, the reasons for this are not solely aesthetics, but they're also to address a changing climate and the impacts of that, especially with increased stormwater and heat islands. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I believe Director Chadwick wants to talk about next steps.
Thank you, Ms. Jabour, and thank you, Mayor Bonnie, through you to council. So our next steps are, in any statutory public meeting process, we wanted to bring the public into this realm of reviewing proposed amendments. What we would then do is we are preparing an amendment to the zoning bylaw. It will look exactly like a bylaw, and it really would be exactly what you hear tonight. A proposed bylaw amendment would be prepared for your future decision-making at a regular council meeting. Council at that time, you could either approve the bylaw as written. Notice would be given to the public and anybody that has requested notification of the decision for a 20-day appeal period, and that takes effect upon decision. You could also deny the proposed bylaw. Again, that 20-day appeal period does take effect. And then lastly, at that meeting, You could also defer the decision to a later date if more information is required. If you felt that we, missed the mark on the proposed amendments and you wanted to make markups and we couldn't do it that night, or you wanted us to maybe review another group that we may have overlooked, which we believe we did not with our notification. But if other information is required, you always have that opportunity to defer. Next slide, please. So at this time, we conclude our presentation to you and to members of the public and open to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. I will open it up to members of council for questions and comments. Councillor Guerin.
That'd be impossible. It's through the mayor. Yeah, just a good report. A couple questions. Was there talk or mention of handicap parking spaces? Or I'm looking at the examples in there of, say, Weston or Parnell, visitor parking and tenant parking, but no mention of handicap parking. That's one question I had. Also, if I'm doing the math right, Weston, for example, an increase from 67 to 93 is a 38.8% increase in parking. Would they have been able to even build that building on that property and still be able to have those additional parking spaces? That's another question I had. Yeah, and that's it for now. Thanks.
Director Chadwick.
Thank you, Mayor Bondi, and thank you, Councillor Guerin, for those questions. The barrier-free parking is a separate requirement. I will let Manager Jabour refer to that. But if I could speak to the comment or the question about could a Weston apartment or could a Parnell apartment even build on the property, it really is site specific. So the creativity would need to be there in terms of what are the other options for the builder or developer to build that number of units. Maybe it's a different makeup of a number of bedrooms per unit. Maybe it ends up being more studios or more one bedroom. The other opportunity, of course, is the creativity with potentially underground parking. The other option is potentially, looking at the surrounding area. Is there a lot that could be purchased by the developer to provide for additional parking? So there are creative solutions that are out there. It's hard to say whether Weston in particular could have built there. I would suspect there's always a solution for every issue. And I will pass it to Manager Jabour to refer to barrier-free parking.
Through you, Ms. Mayor. So our directive was to look at the adequacy of tenant parking, specifically for multi-dwellings and for single semis and townhomes. We did not look at the adequacy of accessible parking. However, we did review accessible parking standards. It was a couple years ago, and we brought it up to AODA standards. So we have had a review to ensure that it meets the current standards under the Accessibility for Ontarians Act.
Through the mayor, yeah. So they're already in those numbers. Then it's in addition the handicap parking as per the code. Okay, and just a couple. Yeah. So I mean, I don't think the Weston's apartment has it's built today would be able to add that many more spaces. They would have to be creative. 32 respondents to the survey is, I'm thankful that we had 32. That's great, but it is only 32. So I'm not sure how much I could take from that. The 2-bedroom units in the multi-level is another one that I'm kind of scratching my head about a little bit, because in not every case does somebody want a 2-bedroom unit because they want to use it for living space. Just like people, build garages, but they don't utilize them for their cars to park in. So in not all cases is a 2-bedroom necessarily going to be filling it with somebody that wants to live in there. Sometimes it's just because it's more cost efficient. They need more space, overnight visitors, that type of thing. So just things to take into consideration, but good report. Thanks.
Guerin, any more comments from members of council? I have one question myself, and it's more so for semi-detached. And if ever there is a consideration of sidewalks and how sidewalks come into play on some developments, for example, Maidstone, when we put sidewalks in smaller developments, we're really stopping people from having 2 cars in their driveway. So is that something, I know that it's different, but it's kind of tied together. And I think that we may need to revisit our development standards manual to have more parking on people's driveways. Like I understand we want sidewalks and we want walkable communities, but I'm not a fan of street parking everywhere. So that's my one comment. Members of council? Councilor Mady.
Yeah, thank you. And through you, Madam Mayor. I had kind of the same thought process. I was looking at the semis and the townhomes, and the parking in the front line. And I was trying to think of how that might look. Are we going to say that a car could park in the front lawn, then we could have a car parked on the right of way, and then the street access? So we'd have like almost like double parking in that area? Or is it more like in a longer driveway where they'd be parking in the right of way in the driveway?
So it would be completely confined to the actual lot. There would be no parking allowed in that right of way. So think of a typical lot with a single detached dwelling on it, an attached garage and a driveway. That driveway is likely already in the required front yard. So required parking would be allowed right on that driveway. You could identify that on your building plans as your required on-site parking.
No? Okay. Any other questions from the members of council? Councilor Hammond.
Not so much a question, just more a statement. I still think I'd like to see our parking minimum from 1.25 for a 2-bedroom bumped up to 1.5, but that's about the only concern I have. Other than the percentages of the front yards, depending on their width, I'm still working on that a little bit, but it seems fair. Yeah, it's just the parking spaces for 2 bedrooms. I'd still like to see that 1.5 rather than 1.25 as a minimum.
Hammond, Councilor, we'll go to Councilor McGuire Blaze and then.
Thank you, through the chair. Just to piggyback off of what Joe said, at the moment, Sears, this report is suggesting that we use the driveway as a parking space. Do we not use that now? That's what we use now? The parking spot is a parking space. So that's not changing. That's not new.
Councilor McGuire Blaze, it's to allow for that space to be counted. So in other words, right now with smaller lot sizes, the required front yard, if it's currently the way it's been written, the zoning bylaw currently does not permit us to count the required space if one space is required and the lot is very short and very small. That required front yard, yes, people are going to park in that driveway. Yes, it's already there for parking purposes, but the language needs to be just cleaned up a bit to allow us to actually count that on a building permit application as a required space.
Thank you, through the chair, just to follow up. So for me, the community behind Canadian Tire, there's clearly a parking issue there. All of them have parking spaces in their driveways, but they're still parking on either side of the road. I think developments like that is why we want to have a bylaw. So including that in the bylaw, that doesn't really fix anything, which is why for me, that 1.5 isn't enough. Because we already see that they already have those, that was already included, and it's still an issue.
Bondi, and to Councilor McGuire Blaze once more. So to clarify, those units within Essex Town Center have garages. So the one required space has been counted within the attached garage. So they've met the building permit and the minimum zoning bylaw requirements. and were given that building permit to construct. An ADU, however, where if the basement wants to, if the owner wants to convert the basement into an ADU, or if they have the space to build a garden suite in the rear yard, the required space for an additional dwelling unit could not be met on the driveway. So that essentially, that ADU building permit would need to go through the Committee of Adjustment for minor variance, because we could not recognize under our existing zoning bylaw that the ADU parking is going to be in the driveway.
Through you, Madam Mayor. So just to further on that explanation, because it sparked a question for me. So based on this, if we were to pass this, for example, and they had in a situation like that, if they had room for an ADU, so we're going to put more, if we don't pass this, they wouldn't be able to put one in, and it would probably slow down some of the parking issues we have over there. Because if we were to pass this and allow the ADUs to have another spot there and count that, then that's going to only intensify the parking in that area. That's already a real problem right now. Is that correct?
Deputy Mayor Shepley. So what it would do is you would be could potentially be making a decision that is inconsistent with the PPS. The provincial policy statement and the changes to the legislation recently require municipalities to allow for tandem parking, one in front of the other. In other words, if one space is required for the main dwelling within the garage, the ADU must have or must be allowed to have tandem parking, one behind the other. Right now, the zoning bylaw doesn't allow that if the required yard is too small that there isn't enough driveway space. The other thing to consider under Bill 23 and the More Homes Built Faster Act, changes in legislation have mandated municipal authorities and planning authorities to allow for more than one ADU per main dwelling. So that's 2 ADUs per main dwelling. What it could do, and a decision going against this requirement or this recommendation rather, could also push a lot of applications to the Committee of Adjustment for minor variance. And that could inundate administration. It could inundate us and have potentially a bottleneck of applications for ADUs where the parking is in tandem on the driveway, because there's a technical issue with our zoning bylaw regulation that currently prohibits that type of parking.
For questions from members of council, I think in regards to the apartment buildings, I think it's a big step forward, and I do understand that we would like to have 1.5, but I think that this is a good gap fill, and we could always change it in the future if we want to go to 1.5. I think this is going to make our residents happy and still keep our developers happy. Any further questions? Seeing none, we have a motion to receive the presentation regarding the review of parking requirements in the zoning bylaw be received. Deputy Mayor Shepley, supported by Councillor Hammond, and all in favor on that. So now we will move to bringing a bylaw to council. Okay. So we will watch for that, and we can also debate that bylaw and tweak that bylaw if we so desire. Okay, looking for a mover and a seconder for adjournment. Councillor Hammond, Councillor Guerin, any questions? All in favor? Okay, see you at 6 o'clock.